If I could give one piece of advice to a young faculty member or to someone who's new to funding, it would be this, and I could summarize it in one word. I'd say collaborate.
It may well be that you have someone in your own department who's getting funding that you can work with. But it may also be that there's somebody in another department that needs a communication scholar or a social scientific scholar to round out their grant. And if you can demonstrate that you can add value, that's a good way to proceed.
Can collaborate with a senior scholar who has already built a track record in terms of research grants.
In terms of trying to apply for grants the first time, I mean, you do feel very green. You feel like you have no idea what you're doing, and sometimes it's just the process of walking through it.
You don't have to do this alone. On your college campus, there are very likely to be other people. Sometimes there are people in your department, but very often there are people in other departments that you can reach out to and talk about ideas with and formulate an idea. And as I was mentioning before, if you, for example, want to do an interdisciplinary project, it's often good to come in as a junior person or as a helper on a larger project.
I was given advice by Scott Poole, and it's really important to get mentorship, I think.
To go to people in our associations, go to scholars who have been funded. They want to give advice. They want to help you. And you know, it's not a zero-sum game. To the extent that I, for instance, can get 4 or 5 of my young colleagues successfully funded, it just makes our discipline look better, and it makes it easier for me down the road. And anybody that's been in on this game knows that's how it works. So don't be afraid to approach people. They'll help you.
I'd like to talk about my first one because I'd written a proposal and I'd had positive feedback, but I hadn't really connected with the agencies. I hadn't communicated or justified why communication, and that was frustrating. And it just so happened that Everett Rogers, who's one of the most successful scholars in terms of getting research and building theory through funded research and that our discipline's ever known, was speaking on campus. And I had the opportunity to take him out to dinner before his presentation. And over dinner, we were having at Sammy's Pizza. I said, he asked me about my research. I said, this is my problem. Here's what I'm trying to do. Do you have any suggestions for me? So he sat there with me. I got him 5 minutes late to his presentation, but he worked out the whole justification process on a napkin. I still have the napkin, and I got the funding proposal. And I know I wouldn't have had it if I didn't have that kind of expertise and experience from Ev Rogers, who talked to me for an hour and 15 minutes about how to justify a grant. So you can write a great idea, and there can just be a small part that's holding you back. And I would encourage anybody to share their drafts with folks that have had funding and get that kind of feedback.
There are a lot of people in communication who've gotten grants now because there's more of a record in the social sciences as well as the humanities. And so that information, I believe, is available, some of it through the NCA office, so that you seek out people who have, and most people who have gotten grants are very willing to help other people and pass on that knowledge.
If you're going to someplace like NSF or NIH or NEH, what you want to do is the first thing is to think about, what do you want to do? You don't want to do a project just to get money. You want to do a project to further your own research or to have an impact in the world. And so you want to think about, what can I do that is of interest to me? And then you go to the various agencies and you look.
I knew that there was an emphasis on food safety, for example. And I knew that a big part of food safety would be in communicating among the workforce at food processing facilities. And I knew that with my background in crisis communication and organizational communication, that we knew how to do an analysis of a workforce to try to help them understand, for example, high reliability procedures. So I started shopping that idea around to the Vice President of Agriculture, to my grants officer, to the people, the department chair in food biology, and shopped those ideas, created conversations. As grants started to go forward, they started to write a communication dimension. And pretty soon my role got bigger, and pretty soon I was able to apply as the principal investigator for grants. So just understanding that I knew that there was an organizational communication dimension to food safety, enabled me to shop our skills that many of us have and wind up with a pretty good sized grant.
And so when one would be a new grantee to NIH, one should start slowly and smallly. If one goes in and asks for $5 million over 5 years and they've never managed a large-scale research project for anyone, unless there are other people on this proposed team, that's going to be suspect.
NEH has summer support, which is a smaller amount. These are the kinds of things you should just automatically start seeking out. And once you have that kind of success, if you want to continue on, you can look for larger grants and start working with other people. And that's, I think, the best way to try it.
There are several opportunities where funding agencies like the National Science Foundation, like the National Institutes of Health, are specifically targeting money for young investigators who are interested in building a research program, not just a single research project. And so one advice that I would give to individuals, to young scholars in our field, is to look for those. One of them is called the Career Award.
There are a lot of grants out there with the NEH, in humanities at least, and also across NSF and NIH, where you can get support just for your own research project. The American Council for Learned Societies is another great grant where you can get support as a junior faculty. They have dissertation level support.
Maybe you have all these data from smaller projects you've done or for a grant you've gotten from somewhere else, and yet you are teaching so much you don't have the time to dedicate to analyzing it and publishing off of it. And R03 is great for that because it is we call it the small grant because it's small. It's $100,000, perhaps over 2 years. It's non-renewable, and that would buy out time in which one can position oneself well to go for something larger.
A really good way for a young scholar or a beginning scholar to get to know funders is to do reviews for them.
You can even offer up your services as a reviewer, send a vita. I find that reviewing NSF proposals is a really great way of learning the type of science NSF supports.
The same way with NIH, it is often the same way with local community funding agencies. If you can, for example, if they require community input, be there and give that input. Because it's by reviewing, it's by giving that input, it's by seeing how the process works that you learn. And that's a really good way to get started as well.
Don't make the mistakes so many of us made. We do what we want to do, we have a line of research, and we go looking for funding that fits our line of research. That doesn't generally work. What works better is to understand the type of research you can do, the skill and methods that you have, and look for something relevant that you can adapt to fit. It's very unlikely that we're going to find funding for what we want to do and what we were going to do anyway, and we're certainly not going to find funding if it's something we could do without money.
In terms of putting the proposal together, I think you just, again, adaptability to the grant, paying close attention to what they're looking for and adapting to it.
It may take you a couple of years to get your feet on the ground, but the only way you're going to learn the ropes is by talking with people and going to these workshops and going and talking also to funders in DC, in the States, and so on.
Really do your homework when it comes to applying for grants, because you've got to understand the call, you've got to make sure your project's adapted to it, you need to create a relationship with the program officer who's in charge of it, you need to be as professional as possible in interacting with them, knowing exactly what you want your project to do and accomplish, but also being flexible, because they're going to come back and say, we don't do this part of it, this part does not fit, therefore it would not, really work for the grant you're applying for.
The second thing I would emphasize is the importance of persistence. I've seen it a lot where people, junior scholars, people at smaller schools, they try once and then they disappear. And it takes a while before one learns the ropes of any foundation or funding agency. The feedback you get from our reviewers is really good feedback, and it starts a dialogue almost. Instead of saying, like what you should have done was, but they say, you know, have you thought of this literature? Have you considered this different experimental design? And it really does inform your thinking as a scientist. And so I would just encourage people to be open to the feedback they get and to be persistent. The average number of submissions before an award is over 2. So it does pay off to keep going.
Moreover, all of the fellowships, ours or from any other funding organizations, they're extremely competitive. Our general success rate is at 5 to 7%. There's no shame in being unsuccessful. So in general, if one does not receive a fellowship in the first year, I would always encourage people to reapply as long as they still fulfill the eligibility criteria.
The odds are stacked against you. I mean, you kind of go into the process knowing that it's going to be an uphill battle. And so you have to kind of go into it and steel yourself to say, you know, it's going to be okay if I don't get this, but I'm not going to give up. And you're going to have to demonstrate perseverance.
It's the school of hard knocks. You know, you just got to go out there and submit and, you know, take your lumps, but don't get discouraged and, you know, don't slink away and just think that you can't do it, because you can. Dozens of your colleagues in communication have gotten funding, and most of the ones I've talked to have gotten funding that exact same way. You just keep trying.